when I was at Cambridge, I studied history, and then I did a second part, part one in law. And at the end of that, like probably many of you, I really hadn't the slightest idea what I wanted to do next. So I did what a lot of people who don't know what to do, and that was went on and did a master's degree in international relations, which was a first year in Italy and a second year in the United States. At the end of that period, I still didn't know what to do, and I managed, but I was in Washington during Watergate. So having not been very interested in politics at Clare, I became absolutely fascinated by the whole political process. And I worked for a trade association on Capitol Hill, lobbying on Capitol Hill, following what was happening there. And then I applied for a variety of jobs. I was the runner-up in becoming an expert on the international legal status of polar bears for the American Marine Mammal Commission. And I was disappointed not to get that, but then I did get a job offer from a Canadian mining company, which would have involved going up and visiting mines in the Canadian Arctic. And that really fascinated me. But in the end, I was more conventional, and I accepted another job offer from Unilever. And I worked for 2 years in Unilever in London in the government relations department. And that wasn't very successful. It was I felt I was part of a large corporate bureaucracy, didn't enjoy it very much. And then a friend said, they're advertising for jobs in the European Parliament. And so I applied to the Parliament, got the job, and went there, leaving the UK forever in 1979, just in the last few weeks of the Callaghan government, and then spent 37 years in the European Parliament, mainly working for committees, but doing a huge range of jobs. What I really enjoyed about it was the variety of the work. It may seem ironic to move from a big corporate bureaucracy to a small, what was then a very small public service, because we were very few in the European Parliament. It were the pioneer days, and it was very unbureaucratic. We all knew each other, but we didn't have many powers. Gradually, as I worked there, the European Parliament became more powerful. And my range of jobs included working with politicians of every nationality, from communists to fascists. I was on the Committee on German Unification, which was a fascinating year. I did election observation in Siberia on one occasion. I worked on rules of procedure, which sounds very boring, but actually I found fascinating because rules can really condition the way an organization works. And I was loaned by the European Parliament to the Scottish Executive to help them draw up the rules for the Scottish Parliament. And then also to improve the rules of procedure for the Albanian Parliament. And probably one of the most fascinating periods of all was when I was the head of the staff of the committee dealing with environment, food safety and public health. And very topical at the moment, we even did a simulation. This was about 2004. We did a simulation of what would happen if there was a pandemic and how the European Union and the European Parliament's working methods would be affected. So I was moved to head up the European Parliament's office in Dublin. And after I retired 4 years ago, I stayed on in Dublin. I'm a dual British and Irish citizen, but I also spend a lot of time in my mother's country of Italy. And since I retired, I've continued doing quite a few things I did when I was following politics. I lecture a little bit in Irish and Italian universities. I'm continuing to do a lot of writing, did an interview project with former members of the European Parliament. And I'm also the chair of a very small charity in honor of my brother, which he was a travel writer. And the charity is trying to promote travel writing on Spain and Latin America and cultural contacts between Europe, the UK, and the Iberian world. So that more or less is what I've been doing. I've really enjoyed the variety of work. And to anticipate your question about what I would advise, it's very difficult to advise people because times are so different from when we left Clare. When, I don't know if that was the case of others of you, but I wasn't worried about what I would do. I assumed that a job, some kind of job would come along fairly easily. And that's, of course, much more difficult now. What would I advise? I suppose the most important thing is to be flexible, not to think of jobs as in a little box. What really impressed me when I went from the UK to the United States and lived for 5 years in the US was the fact that in America, compared to the UK and even most European countries, people didn't think of a narrow career choice. Quite a few people I met had been academics, civil servants, politicians, and even in the private sector, all in the course of one career. And I think having that kind of flexibility is hugely important. The other thing I learned in the US, and this will be my last word, is that the Americans seem to be exceptionally good at networking and keeping up with networks, not just with people in the same career area, but old friends is incredibly useful because you never know when you might change direction, and it's really useful to have those contacts and to maintain them. So I'll leave it there, Roger.
Thank you very much, Francis, for your brevity. I'm deeply impressed, and certainly I know we've talked together many times. So you've had a very interesting career, and through the eyes of the European Parliament. So plenty to reflect on, I suspect. What are you going to do in retirement, Francis? What are you doing in retirement?
Well, I thought I'd mentioned it, but I'm teaching a little bit. I'm doing a lot of writing. I've already written a book on a really boring subject for insomniacs, which is the impact of Brexit on the European Union. And I'm writing a kind of guidebook to the European Union at the moment. And this project, the interview project, I've particularly enjoyed because with 4 other retired colleagues, we've been interviewing former members of the European Parliament. And it's been my first real experience of what it might be like to be a journalist. It's oral. We've created an oral history archive, which you can all follow. It's an archive at the European University in Florence, the historical archives of the European Union. And we just interview people for anything from half an hour to, I'm afraid, in some of my interviewees, including most of the Irish interviewees have been particularly long interviews, including one former president of the European Parliament, Pat Cox, who I finally had to call it a halt after 3 hours. But many of them are much shorter, but they're really interesting because it's not just about politics. It's about how they got into politics, their impressions, the positive things, the negative things. It's personal stories, personal life stories, a little bit like we're doing now, except with politicians. And I've really enjoyed that.